and liftoff of Endeavour.
Since the space shuttle's retirement in 2011, the United States hasn't had the capability to transport crew to orbit. Instead, we've been relying on the Russian Soyuz for almost a decade, while we rush to develop alternatives. The commercial crew providers are now on the verge of completing development of the two crewed low Earth orbit spaceships, Crew Dragon and the Boeing CST-100 Starliner, and today we'll be comparing them head to head. And this episode is sponsored by me. I need more.space/shop. If you want to help support me doing more of this type of storytelling, just pick up a shirt. It would really mean a lot, and I do try really hard to make shirt designs that I think people would like to wear around. So if you want to support more episodes like this, please consider buying a shirt from ineedmore.space/shop. Back to the episode. After the Constellation program, NASA's replacement for the space shuttle, collapsed because of a variety of reasons, the United States crewed exploration program was left with the SLS and the commercial crew program. NASA would focus on deep space exploration, while private industry would take over low Earth orbit transportation. NASA would help develop and fund the capsules and then become their customers, to buy flights on these capsules as needed. The companies were then free to sell commercial flights on these capsules to private customers, tourists, corporations, or even countries that lacked their own crewed spaceflight capability. NASA would gain autonomous access to the ISS from the US again, and the spaceflight companies would raise profits and fund development of better space technology and services. It was a win-win situation. The investment paid off, and the companies ended up creating two amazing modern crew capsules.
And liftoff, the rise of Starliner and a new era in human spaceflight.
First, let's take a look at Boeing's CST-100 Starliner. It's a capsule with a truncated cone shape, similar to other historic US capsules. It's a bit larger than the Apollo command module, but smaller than the next generation Orion being developed by Lockheed Martin. The capsule can carry up to 7 passengers to low Earth orbit, although NASA will use it in a configuration that has 4 seats and some cargo carrying capability. The Starliner features an interior similar in design characteristics to Boeing's commercial aircraft, specifically the 787 Dreamliner. It has a full range of manual controls and large displays that display a ton of crucial data. However, these will be largely unused because the capsule is designed for autonomous operation and will be able to rendezvous and dock with the International Space Station all by itself. At ISC 2019, I did have the pleasure of sitting in a Starliner simulator and docked the ship on my very first try after a quick explainer by a Boeing rep. I did notice that the control interface clearly had space shuttle heritage down to the same exact switch models flown on the orbiters. It was good to see manual toggle switches available in case of emergency. The capsule itself features a ton of new innovations that truly make it a 21st century spacecraft, such as a completely weldless design with interlocking parts. This ensures consistency and eliminates a large part of the unreliabilities introduced by welding. It also has 12 reusable command module thrusters for maneuvering. It also has a separate service module. A sheet of static solar panels are mounted at the base to power the spacecraft's electronic subsystems. It has a lot of thrusters on board, built by Aerojet Rocketdyne, including 20 OMV thrusters, which are used for supporting orbital maneuvers and attitude control in case of a low-altitude launch abort, and 28 RCS thrusters for maneuvering and providing reboosts to the International Space Station. It also includes the pusher-style launch abort system, or LAS, powered by the 4 RS-88 Bantam engines. They use hydrazine, a hypergolic propellant, and although it is admittedly very toxic, it ensures an instant startup from the engines that carry the capsule to safety in case of an anomaly during the launch. The tanks carrying the hydrazine and hydrogen tetroxide are also present within the service module. The service module is attached during the entire course of the spacecraft's mission and separated just before re-entry, exposing the crew module's heat shield. It then burns up in the Earth's atmosphere and is expended with every flight. Starliner's landing sequence begins with the deorbit burn and re-entry. After slowing down because of the atmospheric drag while being stabilized by the onboard thrusters, it deploys its drogue parachutes and ejects the heat shield before landing, exposing the airbags. The main parachutes deploy, slowing it down further, and the airbags inflate to provide a soft touchdown on the sandy desert expanse of the US Army's White Sands Missile Range.
2, 1, launch.
Now let's look at SpaceX's capsule. By 2010, SpaceX had developed the uncrewed Dragon capsule for cargo transport to the International Space Station under NASA's CRS contract. This had been an extremely critical as well as lucrative deal for SpaceX and allowed them to fund the rest of their development. The next logical step was to scale this proven design for an Earth orbit capsule that can safely deliver and return cargo in a crewed transportation vehicle for NASA's Commercial Crew program. The initial prototypes of the capsule were simply the Dragon 1 design with added thruster pods for the launch abort system. This, however, was not the final design. On the 30th of May 2014, Elon unveiled the Dragon 2 capsule, also known as Crew Dragon, and it went something like this. The capsule was a sleek black and white pod that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. A lot like this. Now, the interior was spacious and uncramped. The seats were minimalistic. 4 massive touchscreens folded down from the top, with all of the controls available and telemetry presented in neat animations. It was a 21st century spaceship, but it wasn't just a facelift. SpaceX, in their typical fashion, had done something entirely insane with their new project. The thruster pods wouldn't just provide an abort mode, instead they'd be capable of propulsively landing the capsule anywhere on the planet and beyond with considerable precision. New engines called the SuperDracos were under development, powered by hydrazine and completely 3D printed out of Iconel. 8 of these highly throttleable hypergolic engines would enable the powered descent and landing. The control surfaces of Dragon 2 are largely touchscreen with very few physical switches. Now, there are many benefits to this design. For instance, as the operations of Crew Dragon evolve, they can do updates to control interfaces by just a software patch, rather than physically reconfiguring switches and dials, adding cost and complications. The drawback, well, for now at least, is largely using unproven technology and touchscreens for essential spaceflight functions, but I'm sure that's something that will be part of spaceflight's future. I'm not worried. SpaceX is planning to use the Dragon 2/Crew Dragon variant for a mission to the Martian surface. They called it Red Dragon. The Red Dragon capsule will be launched on a Falcon Heavy into a trans-Mars injection trajectory. It would then aerobrake into Mars's atmosphere and land propulsively. It would carry experiments, payloads, or even rovers to preemptively scout mission sites in the future. However, things changed drastically for Dragon's future. The landing legs that popped out of the heat shield proved to be difficult to qualify for NASA's crew's safety requirements. They weren't massive fans of the propulsive landing method either, and preferred traditional parachutes as the primary landing method. SpaceX had been counting on NASA's support for Red Dragon development and possibly contracts for lander missions. Without any prospects of landing Dragons on Earth or Mars, SpaceX stopped development for the propulsive landing technology for it. Instead, they decided to accelerate development on their larger next-gen Martian rocket, which eventually became Starship. Dragon would now use parachute systems to land. The SuperDraco engine would simply be used now as the abort engines. The capsule would splash down in the ocean like the older Gemini and Apollo capsules. And unlike the Starliner, it won't be reused for crewed spaceflight. However, it will still be modified to be used as a cargo resupply ship for the CRS-2 contract and replace the existing Dragon 1 fleet. You might also notice something that looks very much like a service module on the Crew Dragon, but in fact it is not. It's called the trunk, and it really has 4 main jobs. The first job being to hold the solar panels. The second to hold the radiators that help keep the spacecraft cool. The third being the place that the winglets are mounted to in the event of a launch abort scenario. And the fourth, and which is in my opinion one of the most fascinating aspects of it, is an unpressurized cargo hold. Very much like what the space shuttle had, which allows Crew Dragon to bring supplies, exterior modules, or experiments to the space station that would be accessed via the Canada arm. An American flag was flown on the very first space shuttle mission, STS-1, on the orbiter Columbia in April 1981. When Atlantis flew the final shuttle mission, STS-135, in July of 2011 to the International Space Station its fleet helped build, it carried the same flag and left it on board. The next crew to fly to the ISS from American soil would retrieve this flag and return it to Earth as a symbolic gesture. This has fueled a race between the two companies to get to the ISS first, a capture the flag if you will. This race, however, has been characterized by a ton of unexpected development challenges for both the providers. In July 2018, Boeing Starliner was undergoing tests in its abort systems when the hypergolic propellant began leaking from the spacecraft because of a series of faulty valves. This was a critical issue and delayed the orbital test flight by more than a year. During the pad abort test early in 2019, one of the 3 main parachutes just failed to deploy. This was a cause for concern, but the test was still declared as a success. However, the anomaly that occurred during its orbital flight test is quite a serious setback. The capsule was launched into a lower orbital trajectory instead of a stable orbit, so that if an anomaly occurs, the crew can easily deorbit using the onboard thrusters, rather than having to be stuck in orbit. After separation, the capsule was supposed to perform a series of orbit-raising burns to get it to the ISS and rendezvous. The capsule, named Calypso, portrayed as Atlas's daughter in Greek mythology, lifted off on top of United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rocket in a new N22 configuration, which performed nominally. N22 meaning N for no fairing, 2 solid rocket motors, and 2 Centaur upper stage engines. After a successful separation, however, it began firing its thrusters quite a bit, leading to a rapid fuel consumption. A subsequent investigation revealed that the capsule's onboard computers had picked up the wrong mission elapsed time from the Atlas, and as a result, its clock was delayed by 11 hours. It thought that it was in the middle of performing an orbit-raising burn even though the main engines weren't firing, and began using its thrusters to keep the capsule stable. It also happened to be in between 2 tracking and data relay satellites, which meant it could not receive its commands from the ground. When controllers finally regained communication with Starliner, it had lost way too much fuel. It wouldn't be able to reach the ISS, and docking was out of the question. It was in an off-nominal orbit with weird parameters, and was eventually deorbited and brought back down to Earth. The re-entry and landing was successful. Now, this was an embarrassing flaw for a craft that cost billions to develop. However, Boeing's astronauts do seem eager to test the capsule out on its crewed flight. Now, SpaceX has had its own share of problems with abort systems and parachutes. Now, once the propulsive landing program was canceled, parachutes became the primary landing mode. However, a test in 2019 had shown undesirable results, and so the parachutes had to undergo a redesign, and NASA required 13 drop tests to qualify them. Now, the orbital flight test for SpaceX had gone perfectly. The capsule launched perfectly on a Falcon 9 Block 5, docked with the ISS, had a massively successful series of live streams featuring an absolutely adorable Earth plush, and returned its passenger, a test dummy called Ripley, wearing a SpaceX suit, safely to Earth. However, the most concerning failure came after this. The DM-1 capsule from this mission was undergoing some thruster tests at Cape Canaveral. Then, it suddenly exploded. A red nitrous plume of nitrous tetroxide billowed into the sky and could be seen from all around. A video of the incident leaked, showing the capsule get ripped apart from an internal explosion, making it a very sensational and public failure. An investigation began, looking for the probable cause, and after a few months, it was revealed that it had very specific source. Turns out the video wasn't the only thing that had leaked. A faulty check valve allowed some nitrogen tetroxide to flow the wrong way and form a slug of sorts. When the system was pressurized with the helium prior to ignition, the slug was accelerated straight into the titanium valve, damaging it and igniting it, which led to the explosive failure. The valve has since been replaced with a burst disc, and the system has since been verified by the in-flight abort test, which was awesome. Now let's note that SpaceX received $2.6 billion to develop Crew Dragon, while Boeing received $4.2 billion to develop Starliner. Now, Boeing defended this by saying that SpaceX had already flying cargo capsule that they were just modifying into a crewed version while they had to start from scratch. Now, SpaceX had chosen to perform additional testing on its systems, while Boeing's route involved more simulations and paperwork for qualifying onboard systems. This represents a fundamental distinction between their approaches, and possibly the effects are reflected in their failures. If Boeing had performed more real-world testing, a simulation error such as a clock issue on Starliner may have been avoided. Similarly, if SpaceX had spent a little bit more time qualifying their parts, they would have noticed that putting titanium near nitrogen tetroxide isn't the best idea, and is a known failure mode that has affected spacecraft in the past. Oh, and if you're flying on Dragon, you get to wear this. And if you're flying on Starliner, you get to wear this. So now that we've gone over both spacecraft, let's go over some of their technical specs that you'll probably find interesting. The SpaceX Crew Dragon has the ability to carry 7 astronauts to low Earth orbit, but NASA's opting for 4 or even 3 seats to the International Space Station because they want more room for pressurized cargo. It can survive on its own in low Earth orbit for 1 week, or 210 days docked to the International Space Station. It can carry 6,000 kilograms or 13,000 pounds to orbit, as well as bring 3,000 kilograms or 6,600 pounds back. It can have up to 1,300 cubic feet of unpressurized space with the extended trunk. That is a lot more opportunity to carry cargo. Boeing Starliner has some very similar attributes to the SpaceX Crew Dragon. For free flight, it can survive up to 60 hours in low Earth orbit. Not as long as Crew Dragon, but still a few days, plenty of time to get to the International Space Station or any other point in low Earth orbit. Once docked to the space station, it could stay up there for 210 days because it enters a passive mode. It can also carry up to 7 crew members, with NASA also, again, doing 3 or 4 crew members to the International Space Station, taking that extra space for cargo. And it has no uncompressed storage area. The crewed flight tests for both of these capsules are coming up soon. The US will have its own crewed space flight capability again, opening up many more possibilities for missions. Apart from the missions to the ISS, we may be seeing them being used for a variety of other purposes. Maybe foreign governments will be interested in buying seats for their crews to low Earth orbit. Maybe there will be transport researchers or tourists or engineers to private space stations in low Earth orbit. Maybe we will see them being used to transport crew to cyclers heading to the moon or even Mars. So, who knows? I'm just excited to see crews launching from Cape Canaveral on American spaceships again. So, what do you think about the commercial crew program? Who do you think has a better chance of reaching the International Space Station first? Dragon or Starliner? Wait, Boeing's got to do what? Okay. Well, this is what happens when you film a video a month before it goes out. Turns out, Boeing needs to read 1 million lines of their software to recertify their spacecraft for, human or crewed space flight. And that's likely going to push back first crewed launch, roughly probably about a year. So I think it's pretty safe to say SpaceX is going to win the capture the flag competition. But this is actually a really good teachable moment we can talk about right now. This is one of the reasons why NASA wanted multiple providers for the commercial crew program for events like this. If you look back to the Columbia and the Challenger accidents, when the space shuttle was down, it basically just shut down the entire human space operations for NASA. That's because they had one launch vehicle. One of the things NASA and their international partners learned from the space shuttle is that you need multiple options for access to space, which is why it's been so valuable to have the Cygnus resupply craft, the SpaceX Cargo Dragon, the Russian Progress vehicle, and the Japanese vehicle, which escapes my memory, but regardless, you need multiple options for access to space, and the same thing needs to be for crew. And NASA was hoping that, if the event that something happened on a Boeing spacecraft, they'd still have a SpaceX spacecraft to still be able to access the space station on a regular basis, and vice versa. God forbid something happened with the SpaceX Crew Dragon, they still had Starliner to lean on, as well as the Russian Soyuz. So you'd go from one way to access the station with human crews to 3. So now we're missing Starliner. It's going to take a while, and Boeing is very aware of their mistake. But I was going to put a poll about which one do you think is going to win the space station or what can win the capture the flag, but I think we know who's going to win that race. But I still have hope for Boeing. And anyways, let's get back to the episode. Let me know in the poll above. Now let's have a discussion in the comments about the commercial crewed space flight and if you think it's the right way for missions to go farther into space. Do you think NASA made the right choices all those years ago, or do you still miss the shuttle? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to learn more about space history and just see cool space stuff, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at TJ_Cooney. And please feel free to subscribe and just follow me on my space storytelling journey here on I Need More Space. I can't wait to see what's coming ahead. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.